Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on vicarious liability to a tort scenario. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at a mini scenario involving Alice and some Christmas crackers. We're going to be reminding ourselves of the law on vicarious liability so we can tease out the issues here in this scenario, and we're going to be looking at how you would write out a nice answer to a vicarious liability scenario using the IDEA EA framework. I will do another video tutorial on vicarious liability application in which I just look at standard IDEA. So make sure that you've looked at all the video tutorials on this because it'll really help you to get a good answer in the exam. As always, let's start by reading the scenario so that we know what the situation is. So the situation is that Alice works at home making Christmas crackers. All of the work Alice undertakes and all of the equipment she needs comes from Cracks Limited. Alice works for a rate of £5 per 100 crackers. She can choose her own working hours. Cracks deduct tax and national insurance from Alice's earnings. And recently, Alice negligently put too many bangers in some crackers. Consequently, Cracks is being sued by a claimant for injuries caused by an exploding cracker. And you're being asked to advise Cracks as to their liability in tort. In the exam, the question might be a bit kinder to you and say advise Cracks on their liability and vicarious liability in tort. Or it might be vaguer like this, where you have to work out from the little story which tort you're applying here. Vicarious liability is nice and straightforward to spot though, because what you will see in vicarious scenarios is lots of talk about employment, about how much they get paid, about the working hours, about tax, about national insurance. It'll talk about, give you clues about whether they're an employee or an independent contractor. So even if it's vague like this, hopefully you would have known in the exam that this is wanting you to advise Cracks on vicarious liability. Let's have a quick recap then on what the law on vicarious liability is. Remember, there's a video tutorial that goes through all of the law on this, so it might be worth just doing a refresher on that before you come to this video. But just as a quick recap, remember that vicarious liability is where the employer is held liable for the torts of another, even though they didn't commit the act itself. So Cronton College would be responsible in vicarious liability if I negligently threw hot coffee on a student, for instance. It's where the employer is responsible for the negligent acts of the employee. And remember, that's a logical thing because master has the deepest pockets. The employer is more likely to be in a position to pay and will be insured. And it is their own stupid fault for taking on a careless employee. So there's lots of reasons why we have vicarious liability. In order to prove that the employer should be vicariously liable, we need to meet these three requirements. So firstly, there must be a person has committed a tort, and for us, it's nearly always going to be negligence. And if we think back to the Alice scenario we've just glanced at, the scenario actually told you that she negligently put too many bangers in the crackers. Okay, so that's usually a given for you. So someone has committed a tort, usually negligence. The second requirement is that the person was an employee. And remember, for this topic, we have to distinguish between employees and independent contractors, because your employer will be responsible for negligent actions of employees, but not independent contractors. Now, in order to differentiate between an employee and an independent contractor, we have a number of tests that the court uses. Control test, organisation test, the multiple test, and the sufficiently close test. And our key cases which help explain those tests are there. If you recall, in the more recent cases such as Cox and Aslam, the courts have been more willing to accept that someone's an employee rather than an independent contractor using the sufficiently close test. In general, I think most of the time in your scenarios, they're likely to be employees. Okay, so I would be using this test in particular to help support that. Aslam and Farah against Uber was a really controversial case, if you remember, but it does show that even, as late as 2018-19, there's still dispute as to whether someone's an employee or an independent contractor. So it's not easy. Even the courts struggle to decide. So in your scenarios, when you're applying these tests, it's okay if you can't give a definite answer. You just say, on this basis, it's likely that, on this basis, it could be said that. The best answer in law is usually, it depends, okay? But often for us, we're going to be satisfied they're an employee. Once we've decided, yep, they're an employee, we have to be sure that when they committed the tort, they were acting in the course of their employment. And we've got all our key cases here, and you have to make sure your person wasn't on a frolic of their own. That's a key thing that often comes up in scenarios. So now we've had that little refresher, let's go back to the Alice situation and do what we do in the exam by highlighting what the key issues are now that the law on vicarious liability is fresh in our minds. So let's go through. First sentence, Alice works at home. I'm going to highlight that straight away as being relevant because when we're working out if Alice is an employee or not, that might sort of go against her being an employee. Yeah, because if she's working at home, maybe that suggests she's an independent contractor. Maybe it suggests that Cracks Limited don't have that much control over it. Remember, in these scenarios, pretty much everything that's written there is there for a reason for you to talk about. So when you're reading through line by line, think to yourself, why have they told me that? What's the relevance of her working at home that I need to talk about? So it then tells us that all the work Alice undertakes and all the equipment she needs comes from Cracks. So I'm going to highlight that as relevant. So she's getting all of her equipment, from Cracks. Now that indicates she's an employee rather than an independent contractor, because you'd expect independent contractors to have their own equipment. Let's carry on. Alice works for a rate of £5 per 100 crackers, and she can choose her own working hours. So I'm going to highlight her pay here. She can choose her own working hours. This is indicating, again, that Cracks maybe doesn't have that much control over her if she's choosing her own hours. But Cracks does deduct tax and national insurance, suggesting she is an employee. So what we're seeing here is very common. Some things seem to suggest maybe independent contractor. Other things seeming to suggest an employee. Recently, Alice negligently put too many bangers in a cracker. I'm going to highlight that negligently because that's telling us she has committed a tort, which is requirement 1 for vicarious liability. Consequently, Cracks is being sued for injuries. Okay, so what we've got here is information about how she works and the fact she's done something negligently. In this particular scenario, we're not given any information about what she was doing at the time when she put these extra bangers in the crackers. A lot of the time you will see scenarios where employees go off on frolics of their own. In the next video tutorial that I do on how to apply vicarious liability, I'll look at another scenario that does have frolics in. But this one is really just focusing on the first part, deciding whether they're an employee or not. Let's have a look at how we would apply the law. We know what we're thinking here. We've pulled out the key issues. In order to apply vicarious liability, as always, we're going to use the IDEA structure. But we're going to use the EA on this particular scenario. And in another video tutorial, I'll use just standard IDEA. Okay, so we would start off by identifying our defendant. So here we will be saying Cracks may be vicariously liable for the torts of their employee, Alice, when she put too many bangers in a cracker. Your D, you are defining the requirements for vicarious liability. So there must have been a tort, we must have an employee, and they must have been acting in the course of their employment at the time. Now this is where I'm going into my EA. So what I suggest on vicarious liability, I just think it works quite nicely. Explain all of the rules on determining employee or independent contractor with your cases, and then apply that back to your scenario. Then explain in the course of employment using all of your cases, and then apply course of employment back to your scenario, and then conclude. And I'm going to show you on my next slide a bullet point model answer for this Alice scenario so that this makes a little more sense. This is my bullet point answer for Alice and the Crackers. You might want to pause the video here so you can have a careful read of it. Just ignore the red ones, that's just a rough mark scheme for in class. So I've identified cracks might be liable. I've defined the elements that need to be proven in order to be liable in vicarious liability. And then I would explain all of the tests for deciding whether someone's an employee or an independent contractor with the key cases. Explain it, and then I would apply what I've just explained to Alice. So here I've said Alice seems to be under the control of cracks because the work comes from them. They deduct tax and national insurance. But on the other hand, Alice chooses her own hours, so that seems to suggest she's not under their control. She doesn't seem to meet the integration test because she's working from home. She does seem to meet the 3-part test in ready-mix concrete, and I've explained why, because she provides skill for a wage. Cracks does have some control, and there's nothing inconsistent with employment. And then I've said my sort of conclusion on this bit, that the courts are more willing to find employment status now, and I've used those more recent cases to back me up, suggesting that she's an employee. So you can see in this section, there isn't a clear answer. I'm saying she meets this test, she doesn't meet that test. That's fine, as long as you pull out what's in the scenario and apply the bits you can and try and come up with a likely outcome. And as I've said, my tip is maybe use those most recent cases, Cox and Aslam, to say it's more likely she's an employee. The next E, so we've gone EA, and then it's going to be EA again. I'm now explaining course of employment. So not only must she be an employee, she must have been acting in the course of employment at the time. And this is where you'd explain all of your cases on frolic of their own, travelling to work, etc. Minor bullet points, of course, in your essays you should be writing in lovely full sentences. And then I've applied back. And as I've said previously, this particular mini scenario doesn't really tell you what she was doing at the time that she put too many bangers in the crackers. So there isn't a lot to say here. It seems that she's acting in the course of her employment. She's not on a frolic of her own. And so therefore cracks are going to be responsible for her negligent act here. So hopefully looking at this bullet point answer, although it's written briefly in bullet points, that shows you hopefully a nice way to approach vicarious liability with the EA with a big chunky E on the employees and a chunky E on course of employment, applying it back each time. It is possible to do standard ID, so do ID, explain everything, i.e. the employment bit and course of employment bit, and then apply at the very end. But hopefully you can see from this slide, it just fits quite nicely to explain these tests and apply them, to explain this and apply it, because those bits go together and those bits go together. So I just think this is quite a nice structure. I'm going to do another video tutorial on vicarious liability where I'm just going to do standard idea on it. So if you watch both videos, you can see which you prefer. So I hope that's helpful. Watch the next video tutorial on how to apply vicarious liability.